All right, everybody, hello and welcome to my live machine quilting demo. I'm going to hesitate just a second, let everybody kind of get into the live video, make sure you can hear me and everything's good. We've done several run-throughs, but you never know what happens when you actually get to filming. I am coming to you from the quilt shop, Quilting is My Therapy in Liberty, Missouri. It is rainy and gray outside, and so, sorry, you got it all right? Yep. All right. It's rainy outside, so it's kind of blurry, but it's all right because we're playing with National Parks panels inside the shop today, so having a great time. I'm trying out a little bit of a different format. This is something I haven't done a lot of. I have done live check-ins, but not a live demo, so I have a lot of great people here to help me out. I've got Ruth behind the camera, making sure you can see what I'm doing. I've got Becky, who's going to be asking me the questions that you're typing out, and I've got Wendy kind of making sure that everything is going good and making sense. So hopefully it goes really well. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to show you how I like to quilt the National Parks panels. I have kind of in the last few months found myself completely addicted to these panels, and I've been having a great time quilting them up and using them as decorations for my house. So this is an example of what I've been up to. This is the Yellowstone panel. I'm a huge fan of the national parks. I may or may not have a junior passport that I have to get stamped everywhere I go. I mean, because if you don't get it stamped, it didn't happen, right? Anyway, Yellowstone was a fun trip, and I loved quilting it and then hanging it just like this so that it looked kind of like a poster on the wall. And so we're going to talk about some of the techniques I use for those. But if you haven't been to Yellowstone or you like different parks, there's a lot of really cute panels out there. I also quilted one of these. It's the Badlands. Very cute. And so just a lot of fun colors. So if you've been to the national parks or just want to go, it's great. Or if you don't want to commit to a large panel, there's some cuter, smaller pillow panels. And so those are kind of adorable. So great for any kind of project if you want to piece it into a bigger quilt. But we know I love the machine quilting. I want to get right to the quilting. So I just quilted the panel as it was. And new in, which I'm super excited about this, it's a panel that looks like the map of the U.S. and all the parks around it. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this yet. I might quilt it and then put little pins to all the parks I've been to. So anyway, a lot of fun. But we're going to put these panels aside because we're going to work on the Yellowstone panel. And what I love about these panels, and Ruth, if you want to come a little closer, there's a lot of color options. It kind of gives you a guideline of what to quilt where. And you don't have to be literal with that, but it does kind of give you a good range and a good idea of where to go. So when I get ready to start my panel, I start by picking out all my favorite thread colors. This is the best part. I love all my threads, and so pulling out all the different ones is just a really fun way to play with those different colors. Now, if you don't have as many threads as I do, that's all right. Not many people do. Think about neutral colors in different values. Am I frozen on there, Ruth? Pause for just 1 second. Okay, we're just going to keep going. I think we're having a little bit of technical issues, but I wonder if it's your internet. So we'll just keep going. Anybody commenting about it? Just one. Okay. All right, so I'm picking neutrals in some different shades. I want a light, a medium, and a dark. Okay. All right, well, a little bit of reconnection issues, guys. Is it doing it again?
Nope, it's me.
Oh, hey, Ruth, it's Ruth. I love Ruth. Oh, all right, let me get that away from Ruth. There you go. Is that better?
That's so much better.
Ruth is like, I did not wear my makeup for this. All right, dealing with connection issues. What are you going to do? Maybe this is why live is so fun. Anyway, so I'm picking out my threads. I'm picking out the different shades. I want a range of values, a medium, a light, and a dark. And so what I've got here is I've pulled out some of my favorite grays to put in the mountain and some pretty greens to put in the pretty trees. And so I'm going to just have fun quilting them in. Now, I'm quilting on the long arm because you can see what I'm doing easier. Ruth can kind of get in here and show you the up close, but this is the same no matter what kind of machine you're working on. And please let me know if you have any questions about the process as I'm talking, because Becky will chime in and let me know what it is that you've got to talk about. So I've got all my pretty threads. I'm going to put those aside right now, my little tray, because I've picked the one I'm going to start with. And a quick thing about threads, the question that normally comes up is what do I use in the bobbin if I'm using glide in the top? And I like to use pre-wounds. So I have a couple pre-wounds sat out here so I can get right to the quilting. All right, so now hopefully all the connection issues are over. Come on in, Ruth, let's start quilting. Now I have my medium thread, and this is going to be the first color that I like to put down because it's going to be the one that blends in the most. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the lines that I have here just kind of as a guide to kind of help me out.
It's very blurry.
Yeah, there we All right, so I'm going to start my line of quilting, and it doesn't really matter where I start, but I'm going to kind of get started up here. And I'm just going to use the fabric, those beautiful prints, just to kind of give me a guideline where to go. And I'm not going to be too thought out about it, not too rigid. It's just going to be more of a subtle, more of a subtle kind of line. And I'm just going to start filling it in. Now, since this is supposed to look kind of like a mountain, what I'm doing is I'm kind of adding some jagged lines coming here. Again, it's not too overthought, and I know this might be more difficult for those of you that are a little bit more perfectionist, but I'm just going to kind of start filling this in. I'm not worried about getting it all filled in right now. I'm just kind of adding some little details. Just kind of coming in and really kind of putting down that thread. Now what's nice about this is even though my lines aren't perfectly on top of each other, it really kind of fits the theme that I'm going with, that kind of mountain look. So it's so freeing. I don't have to worry about, is the lines perfect? Does it look exactly how it's supposed to? I'm just kind of adding those little jagged edges like a mountain would have. Kind of filling it in. Now I'm really adding a lot of quilting on top of each other, building it on top just to give it a little bit more dimension. That's because I love the way it looks, but if you were going to use this as an actual quilt, I might not put quite as much quilting in there because it's going to get a little stiff. So this is definitely something I would do more for those art quilts, wall hangings, things like that. What's fun is nobody really knows what this mountain's supposed to look like anyway, so if the details aren't perfect, it's going to look fine. I'm just going to keep building that in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep working in this section, adding some of those details, filling it in with that medium thread, and then I'm going to switch and add the darker and the lighter around it to really make those things pop. So it's going to be lots of fun. All right, so as I'm filling this in, Becky, do we have any questions? Got it. So the question was, when I'm free motion quilting, do I need to change my tension prior? It depends on the kind of thread that I'm using. I want to make sure that the tension is good, obviously. And so if I'm changing thread between piecing and free motion quilting, then I definitely want to make sure I check that tension. And how I check tension is I like to go ahead and kind of quilt a couple circles, kind of overlap some circles, because if you can keep really good tension throughout those circles, then it's going to look good when you get to actually quilting. That's a good question. How about what's next, Becky? Another one?
I think they need to change their settings to HD.
Okay. So if you're having trouble seeing it, somebody has suggested maybe turning your settings to HD on YouTube. And we'll post this afterwards, the clear version, if you're having trouble seeing it. So batting, that's always the question we get. Becky said that was the next question that was brought up. And the batting I'm using on this quilt's my favorite. It's Quilter's Dream Poly. I'm actually using 2 layers to make the quilting pop for the video. And I love it because it just has a nice drape. It feels beautiful. And it resists creasing because it's polyester. So I do love that. And what's kind of fun about this kind of thread painting is I just kind of wander wherever I go. I'm not obviously thinking too much about it. Now, if you're sitting here thinking like, oh, there's no way, just imagine that you're scribbling on a piece of paper, that you're just kind of doodling. When you're done, you're still going to get that look of the mountain because we all know that's what it's supposed to look like. So. Oh, there's dudes watching me too. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, I was taught by my husband's grandpa, the original man quilter is what I like to call him. So very fun. I know we have quite a good turnout here. on the YouTube video. With this particular kind of shape or this kind of element that I'm going for, what I'm really not trying to do is be too precise. I want my lines to be a little jagged, a little wobbly, because that's what's really going to kind of, I don't know, make it look more like a mountain. Now, once I have my guidelines, I like to call these are kind of my guidelines. I kind of have it broken up into sections. Now I can start filling those in. And so I'm going to keep this medium thread. I'm going to still go back now and add a little bit more over what I've just quilted. I know it seems a little redundant to do this and then fill it in, but I like to go ahead and have the guidelines, and then I can come back and add all my stuff. So if I was doing this for a wall hanging, which I am, and if I don't mind a lot of quilting, which I don't, I'm really going to kind of build up those lines, maybe add a few more. It's going to really add a dimension with the thread.
How or what do you do to tidy the threads?
To tidy them? Oh, like when I store them? Okay, so Becky said, somebody asked, how do I tidy my threads? How do I store them? You know, we could take a little pause for a fun little thing. Ruth, if you want to show them. This is how I like to sort my threads at home. That little 3 storage, I have a tray, which is nice to keep them close by. But then also over here, I've got my storage thing with all my beautiful threads. And so that's about as tidy as it gets, if I'm being honest. And most of the time, the threads are on the back of the long arm for me to pick them up. So they're not the tidiest, but, you know, sometimes. All right, that was a good, that is a question I don't think I've been asked before. I do have a separate little thing to hold my bobbins, but I do like to play with my threads. So now just going in. Now I'm actually working in stitch regulated, just because I can go slower so you can hear me. I'm afraid if I go too fast, the machine will be too loud. But when I'm quilting this, I love to do it in manual. Now that makes sense, right? Because I'm always working in manual, and that's when I turn the machine on, it goes the same speed. This means it's speeding up and slowing down with me. In manual, it doesn't really matter what your stitch length is because I'm going to put so much thread on top of it, you're not going to see those individual stitches anyway. So if you always want to try manual, but you've been a little scared, that would be the time to give it a shot. So I'm just building that up.
Talk about your tray, what it is.
Oh, the tray. So that's the tool tray that goes with the handy quilters. It's nice because it keeps all my stuff together. And when I advance back and forth, it doesn't have to move. It just stays right there. So little compartments. And let's be honest, it holds chocolate and wine pretty well. Now, not just any wine. It needs to be a covered cup, but it can. And it does a good job of that too. Just, I hear this is the case. All right. That was a good, I like these questions. All right, so I'm filling this in. I'm almost done with this medium color. How about one more question, Becky, before I switch threads? Yes. I already talked about regulated and why I'm quilting in regulated versus manual. Okay, so I've filled in that area. Now I'm going to come back in with my darker thread. So I've already pulled out a slightly darker thread. It doesn't have to be the exact same shade. It doesn't have to be the same kind. Just whatever you have that's a little bit darker is going to work. And so this is actually, it's like a greenish, kind of grayish, brownish color. I don't know what you would call that, but it's going to be beautiful because it's going to be just a little bit darker than the quilting I just put down. Now, how do you test to know whether the quilting or the thread you picked is going to work, right? You can't look at the spool like this and decide if it's going to work because that's going to give you way too much color. So I like to take the thread out and let it pool on the quilt and kind of see what it's going to look like. Now, sometimes I'll pick a thread color and I'll think that's going to work, but then I start quilting and it doesn't. So I always don't, I'm not afraid to switch it up as I'm going. So you can see it's a little bit darker than the thread I've already used here. Now I'm using Glide. I like the shiny kind of look to the thread. I like how it really shows it off. But if you want it to be more subtle, maybe you don't want the quilting to pop off there so much, using a matte thread or like a So Fine or something that doesn't have that sheen will give you just that nice matte look. So I'm going to change my thread real quick.
And what are you doing with your thread ends?
Oh, so with the thread ends, how do I start and stop a line of thread? That's usually a question I'm asked a lot. So when I start quilting, whether it's on a sewing machine or a long arm, it doesn't matter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up my bobbin thread because if I just start quilting, what's going to happen is I'm going to get little knots on the bottom and I don't want that. So I'll show you how I start a line of quilting just as soon as I get this threaded. All right, so when I start the line of quilting, I kind of position my machine where I want to start, or my quilt under the sewing machine, depending on what I'm using, whether my sit down or my long arm. And then what I'll do is I'll use the needle up and down. I'll hold that top thread, and I'll go down and I'll go up. I'll take one stitch so that when I move the machine over and I pull it up, I'll have two threads. I'll have my bobbin thread on top. And it might be hard to see because it's a light gray, but I'm bringing that bobbin thread up. I'm only taking one stitch. If I take more, it'll end up knotting it. It'll be hard to pull it through. Then I'm going to pull it back to where I started, and then I'm going to take a few stitches in place, and this is just going to help secure it. Now, from this point, I'm just going to start quilting, and I'll come back later and just trim that off. If you don't like the thought of that, you could take a needle and thread and bury them if you wanted, but I don't really like doing that, so I don't, and you have to kind of decide what works for you. I always say, have you ever taken quilting out? That stuff does not just fall out. So take a few stitches in place, cut it off, and then move on. If you're super worried about that, you're like, I don't know, it's a little sketchy, you can put fray check or fabric glue on it, and it'll be fine. Okay, so now I've got my darker thread in here, and I'm just gonna start adding a couple little lines. And this is the fun part, because this is where I really feel like you can start seeing, I don't know, the dimension come out. Now, I should probably start out by saying I'm not an artist. I have a degree in fast food and a minor in. So if I use any artistic terms, those are just things I've seen on YouTube. So I'm just kind of running along, kind of close to the quilting I've just done. I might add a little bit thicker in areas I want it to be darker, but it's going to give it a little bit more dimension. And what's nice about the panel is there are some subtle darker places where the designer's already put in where they see shading. So I can just follow that. I don't have to kind of make up my own. I can just kind of fill in that with a color. And I don't have to worry about making a mistake either, because if I don't like how it's looking, I can come back and put more thread right on top of it until it goes away. So in this instance, I'm just going to keep adding quilting until I'm happy with how it looks. All right, so now I'm going to start moving my way back and forth, adding a little bit of that darker. It doesn't have to stay exactly with the line. Sometimes I'll branch out a little bit, but for the most part, I'm just adding a little bit of those, a little bit of that detail. If I were more like Bob Ross, I would say these are happy little mountains. Okay, so the question just came up, do I ever use variegated thread? I do sometimes, not a whole lot. The problem with variegated thread is if I have a green and a yellow and a gray, I can't really control where that falls on the fabric. So if I'm using a variegated thread, I'm going to use a variegated thread that has different colors than what I'm quilting on. So on this gray, I might do a red, pink, and dark red or something, because since all the colors contrast, it's going to make it all show up or hide, depending on what I want it to go for. So that would be the instance, or if I'm doing like an art piece, it's mostly going to be just like for hanging on the wall or something. So I do use variegated thread, but it's just not as much as the other stuff. But it's so pretty. Okay, so the question came up, what's the difference between stitching in regulated and in manual? So that is a good question, because if you're not sure what I'm talking about, it sounds weird, doesn't it? Okay, so my machine is on right now, and so as I speed up, it will go faster, and as I slow down, it will go slower. And what that's doing is that's giving me nice and consistent stitches. So all my stitches are somewhat, or pretty close to the same length. This is great, right? If I'm worried about my stitch length, or I want to be able to take my time while quilting, I want to be able to speed up and slow down, I can do that, and I don't have to worry about my stitches getting wobbly. Now, this is great. I could do this for ruler work maybe. But if I wanted to work in manual, the difference with that is, I'm going to turn it on manual right now, when I push the button, it's going to turn on. So if I go fast, I'll get big stitches, and if I go slow, I'll get little stitches. Now, I work in manual almost all the time, really all the time, because I like that consistent movement. I like how easy it is to, I don't know, flow with the machine, and it's a little bit more, I don't know, I like the sound of it a little bit better. So it's all personal preference though. I mean, I've taught enough classes that I know some quilters get on manual and they love it, and some, you know, never leave regulated. It doesn't really matter. But for the purposes of this demo, I know it's a little bit easier to hear me when I can go slower and kind of take my time. Hopefully that makes sense. What do you think, Becky? Does that make sense to you? Oh, good. And I'm kind of branching off into the darker part of my mountain. But as you can see, I'm just getting that beautiful texture. Now, even if you didn't want to add detail to your panel, you didn't want it to make it look so much literally like what it is, you can still go for that idea of texture and consistent spacing and still get a beautiful, beautiful look. So for those busier panels where you're like, I don't even know what I want to do, I would just do a nice all over, something with consistent spacing so that it just doesn't draw attention too much to one area or the other. And I'm just kind of imagining these little peaks up here kind of coming down. That's a good one. I'll go ahead and pause and I'll pull that out, Ruth, if you want to back up. So how did I mount this and how did I finish it? All right, so we're good, right? Can you see okay?
Just give me a second.
She's working with this thing. It's being tricky. Sorry.
Okay.
You're doing good. You're doing great. Doing great. So,
Sorry, guys.
oh, I can back up. Here we go. Is that good?
There we go.
Oh, I'll just make it better.
There we go.
Okay, so I had this idea, once we bought all the panels for the shop, which I really bought them for myself, I did my basement decor in this. And so the way I mounted it was with push pins in the wall, just because I ran out of time. I know that's not the right way, but that's how I did it. The way that it's finished, and I'll show you the back of it, this is actually a facing. And so it's kind of like an art technique, and I have it unpinned here. I could say I haven't sewed it so you could see what I'm doing, but I just haven't finished it. It's like a really wide binding, except when I pull it over and I iron it down, I pull it all the way around so you don't see it. And I don't get too like artsy in general, but I really wanted this to look like a poster. I thought it would look really neat if it was hanging up, like, because it's what it's based off of, a national parks poster. So that's how I finished it. And I probably should come up with a better way to hang it eventually, but that's just what I got for now. So that was a good question.
Oh, and then can you talk about what machine you're using today and what your maintenance is on it?
God, okay, so the next question, you want to come back in, Rick? Thank you, you're doing great. The machine I'm using, this is a Handy Quilter Infinity. I use a Handy Quilter Avante at home, but we thought we'd come to the shop so I wouldn't have to clean my studio, was really what I was thinking. So we're doing it here. The only maintenance on the machine, which was the second part of the question, was oiling the bobbin every time you change the bobbin. So pretty low maintenance and a lot of fun. But I want to stress that all my challenges that I do, everything still can be done on a sewing machine. I just like how big this is so you can see what I'm doing and really give Ruth a ability to get in here and see it. All right. So the question was, if I were doing this on a domestic, what would be different? Really not much would be different. I still would go about the same way. I still would put my medium thread. I'd come in here and quilt it, add this detail. The only difference is my hands would be moving the quilt and the machine wouldn't be moving. So a little bit different movement, but the design itself would be the same. All right, so I'm kind of putting in some of that darker. And I like quilting things to death, so I could, keep going, but for the interest of time, I'll stop right here. And I'm going to add a lighter color now. So I've done my medium, now I've done a little bit of dark, and I'm going to put my lighter bit on there, and that's just going to add that little bit of highlight to it. If I'm being honest, it's probably just because I like using a bunch of different threads, and using all my threads just makes me so happy. So for the lighter color, I just have a cream. I could have done a light gray, that would have been fine, but this is just a cream kind of glide. This is a nice kind of soft color. And again, if I had started coloring or quilting with one and I didn't like how it looked, I would just stop and change it out. If it's not working, if you don't love it, just stop, move on to something else, and you can always quilt over what you've already done. Removing this quilting would be very difficult, not fun at all. So I would just keep quilting over it till it goes away. I mean, that doesn't really work any other area of life. Like, you can't be bad with money and then just keep being bad with money and it'll go away. But definitely in quilting, it works. All right, so now I'm going to do the same thing I already did. I'm just going to kind of fill in some lighter areas with a lighter thread. So this actually has a lot more starting and stopping than I normally would do. I don't normally start and stop this much. I try to use one thread color and just kind of keep going. But, in the interest of art, I'm okay with it. All right, so I'm just going to kind of come in, just add a little bit of that lighter. And it's not too light, but it's a different shade. It's going to give it a little bit more of a subtle look. Oop, I'm going to break my thread. Sometimes that happens too.
As while you're rethreading that, suppose you have different weights on the top and the bobbin, how much does that hinder your stitch?
Oh, good question. You can, the question was, if I have different weights on top and bottom, is it giving you trouble?
Sorry, guys.
That thing is kind of
special.
being a pain. You can use different threads or threads of different weights and kinds and types on the top and bottom. There really isn't a lot of adjustment that needs to be made. Once you adjust the tension to fit, you know, your bobbin and your top thread, then you're good to go. So if you do switch from a thicker to a thinner, you're going to have to make some adjustments, but you can use, I mean, some people will use 100 weight on the bobbin so it doesn't show. Some people like me will use thicker thread in the bobbin so it will show. It just depends on your preference. That was a good question too. The hard part about thread is it's such a personal thing, like it's just a preference. So I can definitely share my opinion with you, but I am only the expert of my opinion, so there is that. All right, so adding that detail, just scribbling in there a little bit more. And unlike when I'm normally quilting, when I'm working on a regular quilt, I don't try to leave areas unquilted, but on this it doesn't bother me as much because I think it adds kind of to the realistic look of it. So I'm not trying to fill in every little section. I think it's okay if some of it is a little bit unquilted. I think it looks nice. I'm just going to keep filling it in. I would say the hardest part about any of this is knowing when to stop because I just want to keep going and keep adding stuff. And eventually I have to remind myself that eventually I do want to finish this because I have more projects to work on. And if I need to get from one area to the next, like if I want to get over here, I'm just going to use the quilting to kind of finagle my way down where I need to go. There's so much quilting on here anyway. What's another couple of lines? It's not really going to make that big of a difference. Huh?
Let me know when you want to pause for another one.
Oh, I'll take another question.
Okay. How do you give volume to a flat drawing that is on a panel and shadow using thread?
So how can you give volume to a flat object on a panel? Can you shadow using thread? Yes, and it's a lot of fun. Basically, you're going to do it the same way that I'm doing here, right? I'm going to add my medium color, I'm going to put on my darker and my lighter, and really kind of just add that detail. It's easier if the image or the thing on your panel is something recognizable because then we'll just recognize it as that even if it doesn't look like that. But even if it's just something unrecognizable, it will definitely still help. So it's kind of what we're doing here, adding that detail with the quilting, kind of highlighting and shading there. And you could be more literal with that. I could definitely add a lot more detail with that. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't want this particular thing to show up more than the rest of the panel. I want it all to look really, really nice. Now, up to this point, I've done a lot of dense quilting right here. And you might be thinking, okay, that's great. I don't love anybody that much. There's nobody I want to do that for. If you want to do something on your panel that has a nice texture, you can resort to wavy lines or do some kind of filler. And that's what I'm going to do right here in this area that I'm working with. I'm going to just do some nice curvy wavy lines and kind of talk through why that looks so nice on your quilt. So I'm going to leave that light color in here and I'm going to put it maybe over here in the sky. Right, so how do you add detail in the sky? That's a little tricky. Well, if I'm not sure what to do, I just add some wavy lines. What's nice about wavy lines is it doesn't matter if they're perfect because it's still wavy. I mean, if you quilt a straight line and it's not perfect, that's pretty noticeable. But if a wavy line isn't perfect, who's to say that's not what it's supposed to look like? So the kind of wavy line quilting I'm doing, though, is a little bit different. I'm not quilting straight wavy lines across the whole area. I'm kind of running it into the previously quilted wavy line, bouncing back up. That's just going to give it a little bit of a pop of texture where those lines get closer together. I just kind of like how that looks. Now I'm quilting them kind of close together because I like quilting stuff densely. But you can really spread out the lines of this design and give yourself a softer look, especially if you want it to look like water or something like that. And if I want to highlight a certain part of the panel, I'll just run those wavy lines right into it. And what that will do is kind of separate that element from the background. So here I quilted those wavy lines where they go right over this cloud. But if I wanted that cloud to show up, I would make them run into it and then bounce back the other way, and that would make it kind of pop out. And so I'm kind of using contrast in that density to really kind of highlight the different parts of the quilt that I want to show off. Incidentally, this is something I do with my quilting as well. If I have a part of the quilt I want to show off, I'll use a little bit less quilting, but if I have something I want to hide, I'll kind of cover it all up. And what happens is you start to fill this area in with those wavy lines. You don't really focus on any one part of it because all the spacing is consistent. And when you don't focus on any one part of it, then all you see is that beautiful texture. And so that's really the effect I'm going for. I want to keep all the spacing somewhat similar because I don't want one part to show up more than the other. Got it. Okay, so the question was, why is the panel so flat? How do I have it basted together? So I'm working on my quilt sandwich, but this is actually put on a long arm. It's a little bit of a different setup. I have my backing loaded, I have my batting, and then I lay the top on there. And I'm actually doing what's called a float. I have it just kind of hanging down over here. So I don't need to actually baste it before I get started. However, on a sewing machine, I would go ahead and baste those layers together. So I like to use fusible batting, so I don't have to worry about the pins, but you could use spray basting, you could use pin basting, you could do even thread basting. It really doesn't matter, you just need to hold those layers together. But let me go ahead and warn you about this. We're doing a lot of quilting, so you might get some tucks on the back. We'll call it ruching. You might get ruching on the back. I'm not going to worry about it too much because I know that the front of this quilt is really what I want to worry about. So I'm going to do my best to kind of manage those areas and fill it in, not worrying too much about the back, especially if it's going to go on the wall or as an art quilt or a pillow. You're not really going to see that part anyway. So I don't know if that's just how I make myself feel better, but it works for me and it might just work for you too. That's a good question as well. Oop, I broke thread again. So I'm adding that pretty texture. And if I wanted to, I could, but we have other types of machines as well, just depending on what your needs are. So, and I'll be sure to look for that question in the inbox or in the comments and send a direct message about that.
Or is it like zigzag? Hard to tell on the video. It looks like it's embroidered in gold.
Oh, got it. So the question was about the words, the Yellowstone. So this is actually on the panel. So there's no embroidery there or applique, that's for sure. But she said it's hard to tell in the panel what I did when I was quilting mine. So I really wanted the letters to pop out. I really wanted that to really kind of be a wow. So I left them unquilted. So I got really up close with the stitching in the ditch. And there's that wavy filler that I talked about. Remember I said I like to use that wavy filler to kind of highlight elements, and so just kind of working it in and out of there is going to make those letters really pop. And I really was happy with how that turned out because since everything was quilted so much, what it's going to do is make those letters really pop out. And that really is the most important part of this panel because I remember fondly my trip to Yellowstone and I want to kind of show that off. And then the rest of it, I'm just quilting and adding in all those beautiful details. That was a good question. And even here, like we talked about adding details to realistic parts, the bottom, we're not going to get to the buffalo part of the quilt, but this was a little bit of a challenge for me because it was like, what do you do with a big buffalo? First, I've only seen a buffalo a couple times. Second, I don't really remember what they look like. But what I was doing is going for subtle texture, right? So wavy lines. I was filling in some of the dark, some of the light, adding in a little bit of pops of color, and really just kind of keeping it fairly consistent because I knew the coloring in the panel and the beautiful picture that was already there was going to make it pretty obvious that it was a buffalo or a bison. I think that even if I'd quilted it differently, anybody could come up to it and see it. So a lot of fun adding those details. But in the smaller little guys over here, these ones weren't as important. I'm sorry, a baby buffalo is just the cutest. So these just really got very subtle lines, not near as detailed as the big one because there was no need. I had this big guy right here to show off. And one thing I was super excited about was the grass. I'm easily amused, so there's that. But adding pops of like gold thread to really kind of shine off of there, I just thought that looked really pretty. So I did the same thing that I did in the mountain. I added my medium color, which was this green, and then I added a little bit of that pop of that highlight over there. I wasn't sure if this was going to work, so I actually started all the way over here, add a couple little lines, like let's see if that works. Okay, great, I liked it, and then I continued on. If I had done that part and didn't like it, I wouldn't have continued it. So don't be afraid to try different techniques. If it doesn't work, just move on to something else. It's still going to look really great.
How do you prevent the bottom of the quilt from becoming bowed up in the center as the quilting sucks up the quilt?
Good question. How do I protect or worry about, or how do I take care of the quilt not getting bowed up in the center as I add a lot of quilting? And honestly, that could happen. If you're putting a lot of quilting on a quilt, even if you do everything right, it's going to build up and you're going to get maybe a quilt that isn't perfectly flat. And this one happened to work out okay, so that was good. But if I had one that didn't, what I would do is blocking. And what I do with blocking, I just lay the quilt out, spray it with a fine mist of water and kind of flatten it out, and it will dry flat until the next time it gets wet and it'll bump back up. But on a wall, it would be a little bit more noticeable, so I would take the time to do that. On a bed, it wouldn't be noticeable after a while, and I wouldn't worry too much in that instance. But if you're worried about that happening, just do your guidelines first and kind of build it up. Don't do a lot of tiny quilting in one area and then come out to the rest. And I should preface this by saying, I say this in all my classes, don't do anything that I say and expect to win an award at a quilt show. Okay, this is just for fun. This is just quilting that we love to do. So if you're out there like, oh no, I don't know, that's not for this. This is for just having a good time with the quilts that we're working with.
And what is your little clamp that you're using on your floating top?
Oh, the clamp, what is the clamp I'm using on my floating top? So here's what a float looks like on a long arm, in case you're wondering. See, this is why I like live Q&As. You never know where it's going to go, right? So how I put all my quilt tops, don't trip, all my quilt tops is I like to float it. And that means the backing is rolled around a bar. My batting is laid out, and I'm using 2 layers. On a long arm is no different. I just layer the 2 on there. On a sewing machine, it's a little trickier, so I would start with smaller projects. It's going to get heavy really fast, so this is not something I would do on a big quilt. And then I lay my top down, so my top is just hanging. So even though I have separate layers, though, I can't just start quilting, because what will happen is it will suck up, and it won't be square. And the ideal is we want a square and a flat quilt, so if we can get both, then that's good. So I start by stabilizing around the sides of the area I can work. So this is my quilting area. This is where I can manage it. So this is all stabilized on the sides. What this clamp does is helps hold that quilt in place so that it doesn't come up. And so it's just like a C-clamp. I kind of flex it on there and it just holds it right there. It's not necessary. I do it without it sometimes, but it's just nice to, you know, keep it from getting to the end and realizing the center is now 2 inches smaller than the sides. Then you have to get really creative with the quilting, and that's not as much fun. So that's what that clamp is for, and that's how I'm floating that quilt top. Now I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to switch to a green thread. So now I'm going to add some stuff. Oh, does it? Good. Perfect.
When changing threads, it looks like you tie together and pull through. Do you unthread the needle first?
Good. So how do I change threads? I do the tie off thing. So I'm going to go over to the trees. I've picked out all my favorite colors, so it's pretty green. The way I like to tie off, and I do this on long arms, sewing machines is not as important, but I do take the thread out of the needle. So I don't pull that knot all the way through the needle, so the thread is out of the needle. Then I come over here to my thread. I'm going to pull it out a little bit, trim it off so I have a nice long tail. Then I'll put my next thread on there. And then when I put them together, I'm going to pull them together like they're one piece of thread, like they're just one thread, and then just tie a regular knot. So those 2 threads are together, and I'm tying them together. I know that's kind of hard to see, but you're just going to tie the 2 together in a knot. Then I'm going to come down to the bottom, and I'm just going to pull it through. So I'm going to pull, pull, pull until that knot makes it all the way out. The reason I'm not pulling that knot through the needle is I don't want to bend the needle, because that's not going to be good. So I'm going to pull it out all the way through, then trim off that knot, and I'm ready to quickly thread my machine and then continue on with my next thread color. And so that, when I'm doing these kind of things on a quilt, that's really going to help make it a little bit easier. And so then I'm going to fill in my tree area. So we're going to work a little bit in the green area. I'll probably answer a few more questions, and we'll probably end this first one. And I can't wait to hear what you think about it, if you liked it. If so, we'll definitely have to do this again. So tying off. Now, trees are a little bit difficult. This is a little bit different, right? Because I have the idea of trees, but you can't really quilt teeny tiny trees. So what I'm going to do is, just like I've done already, a nice texture in the background, wavy lines, and then I might come up front and add something that looks like trees where we can see them. So just kind of nice and jagged. When I'm adding details to the quilt with the quilting, I'm not worrying about it being literal. It doesn't have to be a literal tree, or an aspen pine as opposed to a ponderosa. I'm just adding the idea of it, right? So the idea that there might be trees back here. And if you're watching this and you're thinking, I don't know, I can't do that. I'm telling you, I'm basically just scribbling with thread and trying to sound like I know what I'm talking about. That's about all there is to it. But what's nice about it, since it is something recognizable, people will be able to tell what it is.
Sometimes I quilt and the areas that are less quilted puff up so much. Any advice on how to balance it or what the ratio should be?
Perfect. So the next question was, sometimes I quilt and I'll have areas unquilted and it puffs up so much. What should the ratio be, or how can I prevent it? So the thing about unquilted areas, I think people will notice an unquilted area before they notice a gap, or they'll notice a gap before they notice an error. So I would try to fill everything in as consistently as possible, unless I want it to show off a little bit. So I will use an unquilted area to really kind of highlight something. And as far as the ratio goes, it's all preference. Like there's no right or wrong answer as far as usable, a quilt. I would say for the most part, I would keep it within a range, right? So if my tiniest quilting is a 1/4 inch, maybe my biggest quilting is an inch, maybe a 1/2 of an inch. But the great thing about doing something like that is if you don't like how it looks, you can always come in and add more quilting. So when in doubt, I would just err on the side of leaving bigger gaps, knowing that you can come in and fill it in. Even if you're not sure what to fill it in with, you can just add some echoing. You could add a different kind of filler. It doesn't have to be the same. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's more of a personal preference. All right, so I'm kind of filling in that lighter and kind of adding a little bit with the darker. I know you can't really see the individual details. I'm just kind of going for the gist of it, the idea, a little bit of a different idea. Now I will say when quilting, especially, well, really either machine, it's tricky when you have the shorter lines, the quicker changes of direction. So as I'm quilting these jagged lines that are shorter, those could actually be a little trickier. I'm just going to take my time and kind of imagine that I'm a ping pong ball bouncing in and out of an area. And as you can tell, these don't really look like any particular trees at all, but they're kind of going the way a tree would go. They're kind of pokey like a tree would be, and it's going to be fine. Now, if I had time, and one thing I think would be amusing is quilt little pictures in there, maybe little animals or something. It'd be cool. What was the question? The question was, how long does it take me to quilt a panel? It takes longer than it would a quilt, and that's obvious because there's so much more thread to it. But there's a lot more, a lot more of the artistic component of it, because I'll quilt it and then I'll say, oh, maybe I'll add a little bit of yellow, and they'll do that. I'm like, oh, maybe I'll add some more green. So I tend to think of this more as a process. I mean, I definitely want a finished quilt when I'm done, but it's more about the playing with it and having fun with it and seeing what it can come out to be. So I couldn't give you an exact time because I'm not really good about keeping track of that, but I don't know, several hours. But the thing is, when I do quilt though, I'm quilting fast, I'm not hesitating. So if it's taking you an insane amount of time, you can say, you know what, maybe I'm just overthinking it, because what's nice about this, I don't have any, seams to stitch in, I don't have any perfect things that need to be done. This is more just a relaxing thing. So this is where in a class people get annoyed by me, but that's okay. I'm sure you won't get too annoyed by me. It's meditative. I know you don't, if you're new to it, it doesn't feel that way, but if you've quilted for a while, you kind of get to that point where you just zone out and it's just fun, right? You're just kind of filling it in. And so it takes me a little bit longer to do these because I think I tend to enjoy them a little bit more and I kind of savor it a little bit. So I could go ahead and move on, but I think I'll add some more thread colors to it, kind of thing. And
Using the same color in your bobbin, and have you ever used 2 colors at once?
So am I using the same thread color in my bobbin, and have I used 2 thread colors at once? So I'm using the same gray bobbin in the whole quilt because it's just easier when I'm switching thread colors, especially since I'm switching a lot. And I'm not worried that the thread color is going to show. And I'll back up from you, Ruth. You don't have to move, but I'll show you the back of this quilt. So I did a lot of the same, even though it's a busier print, I did like a tan color. So you can really see the quilting kind of building up in places. Even though there's so many different thread colors, I just kept the same one in the back. And that meant sometimes I had some weird areas and sometimes I didn't, and I was fine with that. If I was worried about the back, first of all, I would make sure I change thread colors to match, and I also would use a solid back because I would want to see the quilting. If I'm going to take the time to switch bobbin colors and do all that, I would make sure you can see it. However, if you're worried about the tension and you're thinking, I don't know, this is going to look right, what you can do is get a busy fabric. So this is one of the prints from the National Parks line. It's busy. You can't really even see what's going on, even when she gets close. And if you could, well, you hopefully wouldn't see all the mistakes that are in it. So sometimes I use the same thread color. Sometimes I change it. It just really depends on the mood I'm in, to be honest. And then the second question was, have I ever used 2 threads at the same time? And I have, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So if you noticed on the long arm, has 2 thread spools. That allows me to run 2 threads through the needle at the same time. Now, I didn't do that on any of these panels because I wasn't really doing that. But what's nice about it is as a thread twists, you get a different color kind of come out. So if I'm doing literal thread painting, like I'm making a butterfly, I want it to be very detailed. I might do something like that so I can get a little bit of a shading to it. But for the most part, this is definitely going to be something that's more art technique, more art quilt, more wall hanging. I have done it a couple times and I love the shading. So now I'm going to do the same thing I've done, except I'm going to pull them all through. I'm going to tie all 3 of those together. So I cut this off so I can hook on the next one. Now, this is going to be a little trickier because both threads have to go through the needle. And I don't really even change the size of the needle for it. I could probably go up and that wouldn't hurt a thing, but for the most part, I just keep it the same size. So now I'm going to try to thread 2 threads through the needle while everybody's watching. That should be real fun. See? Oh, look at that first try. What? All right, so now those are both through there. And you can kind of see right here where I'm talking about that twisting, where the thread's not going to come off the same area. It's going to just like quilt. And maybe I'll do it over here in this gray where you can see it a little bit more. So the quilting is going to be thicker. This is going to be nice, right? What this is going to do is help you fill in an area a lot quicker. And then I'll quilt a little bit. Use some little. Now I will say this is something that does not lend itself well to video or pictures. I've tried, but you know what? Ruth is a professional at this. Maybe she can get it for me. So as you come in, when you look at the stitches, sometimes you can see one color, sometimes you can see another color. It's just going to give me a little bit more of a, not quite variegated, right? Because I don't want a repeating color. I want both of them kind of switching in and out. And so it just adds a little bit more to that look. Really, really fun for, like I said, art quilts or kind of panel quilts. So I'll do a little bit with this. So maybe take one more question, and I think we will end this for this week. Becky, you have one last question?
What needle size are you using?
Okay, so what needle size am I using? The needle size you use really depends on the type of thread you're using. So this one is a 16 or an 18, because this is a 40 weight, and so that's going to help it give me the best tension. If you're having trouble, if you changed your thread and you kept the same needle and it's not the right size, definitely want to use the right size for the needle, because right size needle for the thread, because that's going to give you the best result. You might think it's okay to use a thinner thread with a bigger needle, but that's actually not always the case, because there's a special groove in the back that thread kind of sets in. So, and even though this thread is super dark and 2 threads at once, I still am loving how it looks. And then the last question, did I have to change tension at all when I went to double threads? I didn't. I'm sure maybe I would have to make some adjustments. I'm not going to crawl under there and look while we're live on this video stream, but there probably is going to have to be some adjustment, and you just have to know that you're going to get some wonky spots in different areas. So don't be too perfectionist on that. Use the busier backings for that. So a few tips when working with panels: think consistent texture. Think shades of color. The more time you can put in it with different shades, really going to make those elements pop out. Now, if this is for a last-minute baby shower gift, then 1 thread over the whole quilt, no problem. But if you want to have fun and really play with it and turn it into some home decor, it's going to be really fun to use all the different threads. Don't be scared to try thread colors that seem weird. I've used orange, I've used pink, I've used purple, even on these national park panels, just depending on where it pops out. So I hope you've enjoyed this 50 minutes that we spent together. Sorry for a little bit of technical glitches in the beginning, but hey, that's what happens when you go live. I would love to know what you think about this format. If you like more edited videos, more concise, or if you kind of like watching it come together and kind of seeing how that process works, or if you like both. So be sure to leave a comment in the video, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. I'll have an announcement on a new free motion challenge quilting along. I think that's going to be coming up next week. We'll get to announce it, and we have a lot of fun goodies in store. But I appreciate you stopping along today for this little demo. I will see you soon. Happy quilting.